Thank you for joining us for Day 3 of Be a Jewish Upstander, a Call to Action. Again, I'm Max Potashnik, Director of Government and Community Relations for the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, and it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon for our third day in a week of programming to figure out how we as members of the Jewish community can live up to our values, our history, and figure out how we can best be allies in supporting immigrant and refugee communities today, which, as we know and have heard thus far, have been particularly impacted by COVID-19 these days. So today we're going to be hearing from Jorge Barón, who is the Executive Director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. If you missed Day 1 or 2, Day 1 was Rabbi Seth Goldstein talking about our Jewish history and values. Day 2 yesterday was Tammy Gilbin from the Jewish Council for Public Affairs talking about the federal side of these things. Please go ahead and go to our landing page at jewishinseattle.org. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Jorge Barón. As I mentioned, he's the Executive Director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. Thank you so much for joining us. He's been with the organization since 2008, having previously worked as a staff attorney for 2 years. Jorge's passion is advocating on behalf of immigrants and is firmly rooted in his own immigrant experience. He's originally from Bogota, Colombia, and came to the US at 13. He's a graduate of the Yale Law School and Duke University and lives here in Seattle with his wife, Tyler, and their 3 children, Isabella, Luna, and Luca. And if I may say, those are just beautiful names. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And Jorge is going to talk about the work that his organization does, what they're seeing across Washington State today, how the immigrant refugee communities here are being impacted, what has changed in the world of COVID-19, and then most importantly, how we can all step up and be allies and help in that effort.
Well, thank you, Max. Thank you for that introduction, and hello to everybody, all the friends of the Federation. We're grateful to be invited to participate in the series, and I'm just honored that all of you are spending time learning more about this topic and finding ways that we can all support each other and make sure that all members of our community are supported equally, regardless of where they were born. I want to start just a quick intro, and I want to say that I'm going to go pretty fast through what I wanted to just highlight, because I could, as some of you who know me may know, I could talk for hours on this topic, and so I'm going to try to keep it really quick, and we're going to try to see if we have a little bit of time to take up a couple of questions. So if you do have any questions that you want to put in the chat, we'll try to tackle those at the end. But just a quick intro about our organization for those of you that are not familiar with it. Northwest Immigrant Rights Project is a nonprofit that's been around since 1984. We provide, our main focus is on providing immigration legal services for low-income people, folks who cannot afford private attorneys, navigating the maze that is the immigration system. And so most of our work is helping individual clients navigate that maze and trying to obtain protections for them to be able to stay safe, stay with their families, be protected from violence. So that's most of our work, but we also engage in what we call systemic advocacy, mostly through litigation efforts, but also public policy advocacy that I'll touch on later. And then our community education work is focused on helping immigrant community members understand the realities of immigration policy and changes that we'll talk about, and also just helping educate the broader community about what immigration looks like right now. We are a statewide organization. We serve the community from 4 offices in Seattle, Tacoma, Wenatchee, and Granger in the Yakima Valley. So I wanted to just kind of highlight a few of the issues that are most pressing for the communities that we're serving right now in terms of how we're dealing with COVID-19. And I wanted to start by just highlighting how the disparate impact that this is having on many communities across the state. And I want to emphasize, we don't have specific statistics on immigrants and refugees. No, the Department of Health has not broken it down that way. And there may be some good reasons not to ask questions about, citizenship status or anything like that. But what we do have are statistics relating to race and ethnicity. And I wanted to just share these because I don't know if folks have actually had a chance to see these since they were released kind of more recently. But they just kind of highlight how the current infection and the public health crisis is having a fairly disproportionate impact on people of color, and particularly people from the Latinx community, or people who are labeled as Hispanic in the chart that you see here on the screen. As you see, the rate of infection of the confirmed cases so far in Washington State, 30% of them have been from people who identify as Latinx, whereas we're only 13% of the population. And so that to me is one of the concerns that I have, because we're hearing deep concerns right now about the potential of people being exposed. The reason for that, we think, is because a lot of those workers, a lot of folks who identify as people of color, are disproportionately in a lot of the places that are at higher risk of infection right now. So we're deeply concerned about that. I will note that, to be fair, the rate for deaths is a little bit differently, and you see a different numbers if you go to that data. But we think that has to do with the rates of the age of people. And just to highlight, because we can talk about numbers and percentages, but just to illustrate, I think, the point that I was making, I wanted to just highlight the situation with a gentleman, Lupe Olivera, who tragically passed away in the past week. He was a worker at the Tyson's food plant in the Tri-Cities area in Eastern Washington. And as some of you know, there's a big outbreak at the meatpacking plant there. And he's an example of one of those workers who has been exposed, and now there's, I believe the latest number was around 124 workers or people related to the workers who've been exposed. And so this is the reality that a lot of people in the community are facing, is the prospect of having been exposed, and then, as we'll talk about in a minute, not as many safety nets. So I just wanted to highlight Lupe's story. And I particularly wanted to talk about Lupe in a second, and just honor his work and his life, and the fact that he, literally, gave his life in order to make sure that many of us would have food on the table, because his death actually happened on the very same day that the president announced this new proclamation. In case, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So this is, as some of you may recall, last week the president announced this suspension. He, by tweet, initially kind of previewed that there was going to be a suspension of immigration. And at first we were all kind of, really, all immigration attorneys were like, what does this mean? And it was very unclear. And ultimately what it has meant is that he's not actually pausing all immigration, despite the fact that was kind of how it was initially advertised. What it has actually meant has been that it stopped the ability of people to bring family members who have been waiting for a long time from other countries. Not completely, but some categories of immigrants who are trying to reunify with their families. And I try to connect those two, because I don't know all the details of Lupe Olivera's story, but part of the story was that he had come to reunify with family members in the U.S. In Tri-Cities. He had come from Mexico. And so, the very day that Lupe died was the same day that the president was sort of announcing that he wanted to, keep people like him from coming into the U.S. And I thought that was just a tragic, coincidence of timing, that as people who are working in our communities and facing these risks, the president was trying to block the very same people from being able to be together with their families. So this is having, and I think I did want to highlight, the president's proclamation, as written, is a 60-day kind of temporary order. But as I remind people, when the president announced the travel ban in 2017, that was supposed to be a 90-day order, right? And here we are years later, and we are still dealing with that travel ban. So I think we need to be very careful, because I think most people are sort of saying, well, it makes sense to have a temporary pause. But the reality is that many of us are concerned that this is really setting the stage to really undo the already sort of limited options that people have to be able to reunify with families. And some of those folks who are impacted by this have literally been waiting, decades to be able to reunify with families. So it feels particularly unfair for them to be blocked. And it's important to highlight that the suspension didn't block temporary workers from coming in, right? So So it was only people who were actually planning on settling here permanently who the president blocked, not people who are coming temporarily. And I think that this highlights that I think his intent is more to really stem ongoing and permanent migration into the US. So those are things that people have been very concerned about. The other things I wanted to just highlight a few things that are really concerning to people right now, and that is that that as people are dealing with the impact of the public health crisis, and of course, many communities and many of us are dealing with impacts, but for folks who are undocumented, who have limited immigration status, who don't have immigration status, permanent immigration status, or who are part of a family where one of the members might be undocumented, the current crisis is having a particularly severe impact because they do not get a lot of the safety net programs that many of us and many people in the community are relying on. So to give you just a couple of examples, right now, many of us are receiving these checks from the government for that the Congress approved at $1,200 per individual and at $2,400 for a couple if you meet the income limits. Who is not receiving those checks, besides people who have higher incomes, are around 75,000 families here in Washington State and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, across the country, where they actually, even though they've been filing taxes, the reason that they're not going to receive those payments is because one member in the household has been using an ITIN number, which is an individual tax ID number. And that means, and that generally, not always, but almost always is the result of the fact that that person is undocumented. And it's very common that undocumented people frequently pay their taxes with this ITIN number. IRS knows that they get those taxes when they pay them. But now that it's time for the government to provide support to these families, they're being denied the stimulus checks. And not only is the undocumented person being denied the check, but if that person is married to a U.S. citizen and has U.S. citizen children, as many of those families do, the entire family gets denied the stimulus check. So to give you an example, a family like mine with 3 children, as Max mentioned, we would normally get a $3,900 payment, right? But if I was undocumented, the entire family gets 0, even if the spouse and children are U.S. citizens. So this is having a very severe, disparate impact in who's getting support right now. On top of that, folks who are undocumented and who lose their jobs, even though most of them have actually been paying into the unemployment insurance system through deductions in their paychecks and things like that, they don't get unemployment if they get laid off. So we have gotten a lot of questions from people who have been laid off from positions that they've had for sometimes even decades, and they're not getting unemployment. They're not eligible for unemployment because it's governed by federal rules that prevent people who are undocumented from getting those payments. And then on top of that, many of you are familiar or might have heard of something called the public charge rule, which was something that the Trump administration put in place. And as it turned out, the timing could not have been worse because it went into effect on February 24th. And it's too complicated to get into details here, but it basically has discouraged a lot of people from seeking public benefit, sometimes just because they actually misunderstand the scope of the rule. It is a pretty severe rule and it will have a bad impact, but oftentimes people are confused about what it means. And so folks, for example, who might actually be eligible for employment insurance are afraid of collecting it because they think that's going to harm their chances of eventually getting a green card or being able to stay in the United States. So we're hearing of a lot of community members who are, even folks who do have who do qualify for the safety net, are being prevented or chilled from accessing that safety net because of that. And then finally, the folks who do have the jobs are frequently the folks who are at highest risk. So we see immigrant workers in places, as we saw with Lupe, in plants, in farm work, in other areas who don't have the luxury of, like many of us do, to work from home, and who are therefore at much higher risk. So those are some of the issues that we're seeing. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, in case if we can go to the next slide, is the situation for folks who are in immigration detention. Many of you are familiar with the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, which is the regional immigration detention center. And one of the things that we're deeply concerned about right now is the situation for people who are detained right now at the Immigration Detention Center, because all around the country, the places where the infection has gotten the worst in the last few weeks has been in prisons and jails, and also in immigration detention centers in the country. So we worked with, we were concerned with that very early on, and of course, because Seattle was one of the original initial hotspots for the infection. Working with the ACLU, our organization filed what we think was the first lawsuit in the country trying to get people released from the immigration detention center during this COVID-19 epidemic, and people who are at high risk for complications in that situation. That lawsuit has continued. Unfortunately, we have not gotten an official ruling from the judge to release all the people that we wanted to get released. Or originally, there were 9 cases that we identified. After some pressure from the litigation, 4 of those clients have been released, thankfully. But there's still a number of individuals who we consider high risk right now who are there. I'm personally working with one client right now who I'm trying to get out, who and folks may think, well, these are people who recently arrived in the United States. They are not. The client that I'm working with right now has been living in the United States for 30 years. And has been held in the detention center since late February. She has been treated for TB recently. She has asthma. She has other health concerns that make her very susceptible to infection. And she is, as we speak, in the detention center in a place where there is absolutely no social distancing possible in there. And so if the infection gets into the facility, we are deeply concerned about the impact that might have on her. So we're working very hard. We did get one person, in a separate case. We got a great ruling from a federal judge, from Judge Martinez yesterday, that ordered the release of one of our clients. So there's some progress in that, but I would just highlight how important it is for also members of the community to be paying attention to this issue, because we're deeply concerned about the potential for a very grave health crisis if, as we suspect, and in fact, the judge yesterday kind of found that it was inevitable that there would be infections there. And let's go to the next slide, Casey. And I think it's just a good reminder of the situation that when folks are there in the immigration detention center, one of the challenges that we have, and part of the reason that we're deeply concerned, is because they don't have the right to appointed representation. So that's also part of the challenges that the immigration court has continued to operate in these settings, and folks are still going before immigration judges. We actually do want the court hearings to continue, because it's the only chance of people to be able to get released from detention at this point, besides the legal work that many of us are involved in. But it does create the situation where risk is continuing, and folks are not getting representation as they generally are not entitled to. So that's a big challenge. So those are some issues. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight in the next slide is the fact that we are actually currently waiting for a major decision from the U.S. Supreme Court. On top of everything else, we are waiting for a decision from the court on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA program. And I use this picture to highlight that, because Maria and Adriana, we can talk about sort of like groups and the 17,000 DACA recipients across the state, or the 700,000 across the country. But I wanted to share Maria and Adriana, because I just want to remind us that these are like human lives, human beings and human lives, and our neighbors who are in the line right now. And the bottom line that the Supreme Court is considering is whether they will be able to keep the work permits and keep the temporary protection that President Obama launched in 2012. The Trump administration has been trying to take that away since 2017, and has been blocked because of these court challenges from doing that. And so now the Supreme Court is considering whether it sort of gives the go-ahead to the Trump administration to take away their work permits. And we think that is a terrible idea. We think it's illegal what the administration is trying to do. But of course, the current Supreme Court has been very lenient and very willing to give the administration the sort of the benefit of the doubt in passing in adopting these immigration policies. as we've seen with the travel ban in other cases. So we're deeply concerned about that prospect, not only because of what it will mean for people like Mari and Adriana, who were kind of two of our first clients who got DACA protection, but because people like Adriana, for example, are nurses, and they're like literally on the front lines right now of our public health crisis. And it's particularly counterproductive, and it's going to hurt us all if we are taking those contributions that people are making away from our community at a time like this. So I just want to highlight, because that you may be hearing about that in the coming weeks, about this decision, and the impact that it's going to have is pretty, could be devastating for a lot of community members. So that's the update. I wanted to highlight a couple of different ways that you can get involved in this response, and we can talk about just briefly. Mention about the safety net gaps and the fact that there isn't protection for a lot of people, the lack of unemployment insurance, the lack of stimulus checks. So a group of community leaders led by the Washington Dream Coalition that we're supporting created kind of a temporary fund right now to help support families in the immediate need that they have. And I've been incredibly proud of the work that they've done. They've raised $1 million as of yesterday, which is really impressive for a total grassroots effort. The sad part about it is that they also have received over 13,000 applications for support. And so the money, it doesn't go far enough, even though it's a substantial amount, to address all the needs. And so the sort of more intermediate and longer term strategies that we hope you will help us support is we're asking the governor and our state legislature to step in where the feds have failed, and to create a state-funded worker relief fund. Our ask is for $100 million, which might seem like a big ask, but if you consider the number of families who are not getting those stimulus checks from the government, that's actually less than those families would actually get who are not getting those checks. And so that's actually kind of an undercount of what the need really should be. And then we're also asking them to create a permanent state unemployment system for workers who are ineligible for the federal system, and that would primarily impact undocumented workers. So we hope that you will be willing to share with your representatives and with the governor that you support those kind of programs, because we feel really problematic that so many in our community are being deprived of those opportunities. So let me pause there and see what questions Max may have for me from the group that we can try to tackle in a few minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I mean, incredibly informative, enlightening presentation, and also really appreciating the humanness that you're bringing to these really challenging issues, the voices and the faces of those who can't be here themselves. And, in that regard, I wanted to share with everybody who is with us that the 2 action pieces that Jorge shared will be sent out in a thank you email. So you can click on the links there. We've also pasted them into the chat box. So the temporary relief fund is the first link there. And the second link there is to ask Governor Inslee and legislative leadership to create this worker fund here in Washington State to help those who are currently ineligible for funds. So it looks like we do have time for a couple questions, and we had several come in, so I'll do my best to get to all of them. The first question that came in the Q&A was from Dario. Dario is the rabbi of the congregation Kol Shalom on Bainbridge Island. He says that he and his wife came here from Argentina 6 months ago, and he asks, how can we help in creating consciousness on this crude reality?
Well, I mean, I think the key thing, you're taking the very first step, which is really important, which is to educate yourselves and learn more about what's happening. But I think what I find is that we just need to make sure that other people in the community are aware of the situation. I think when I talk to people, for example, about the injustice of the stimulus checks, of families being deprived of literally U.S. citizen, U.S. born children, who are being punished essentially for who their parents are. A lot of people in the community find that unjust. And so I don't think that message that's happening right now, that literally families in our neighborhoods are being deprived of those checks, simply because of the immigration status of one of their parents is getting enough attention in the community. And I think it is important for us to highlight that, to say, that might be what the feds decided, but here at the state level, we feel like we have a different set of values and we can do something here locally. And so I think that's really important, is to share and spread the word and share that you feel like this is unjust, because I think that's the only way we're going to get the attention of our representatives, who of course have a lot to handle right now, and there are a lot of needs. But I just feel like this particular community is being much more heavily impacted than everybody else.
Absolutely, and I would share that it's come as quite a shock to those who have just learned about the limitations on the stimulus checks. Tammy mentioned it yesterday, and a number of people have just been really horrified in that regard and reached out. Let's see. I also wanted to mention that these webinars are being recorded, so if folks want to share them, that's a great opportunity. It's half an hour. It's a pretty manageable segment for people to do a lot of learning and figure out how they can work and take action in a short period of time. There's another question as to what is the rationale of the court in not supporting the release of these high-risk individuals from the detention center?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the initial ruling that we got from the judge was essentially that, unless there was an actual case inside that there wasn't sufficient risk at the point that was demonstrated, and we respectfully disagreed with that assessment, because of course, by the time you get an infection, part of our point was that once you get an infection in a place like the detention center, it's almost too late, because by that point it's almost inevitable to be able to separate people out, because people have been in contact. And as public health professionals have repeatedly found, we're seeing that asymptomatic transmission is very common. And so by the time somebody actually gets sick, they've already spread the illness to a lot of other people. That's how we're seeing the issue in plants and other places. And so I think the ruling yesterday from the judge, where he kind of Judge Martinez recognized that the person needed to be protected, even though there hasn't been a positive test here yet at the detention center, is important. But I think the other challenge is that, also what we found through the litigation is that ICE isn't testing people. And so, and in fact, my client that I've been trying to help, she has developed some symptoms that she's concerned could be COVID-19, and they've refused to test her. And so it's easy to not have confirmed tests when you're not testing. So that's the challenge that we're having right now, is that ICE has refused to actually engage in a full testing process. I'm fairly confident right now that there's already an infection inside the facility. We just haven't identified it yet.
Absolutely, thank you. Looks like we have time for one more question, and that is, how do we hold those in the Northwest Detention Center accountable for not being transparent about who is sick and testing?
Well, I think I would encourage people to make sure that you're reaching out to your federal representatives. I think both to press them to do more, but also to thank those that have been very active. I will say that Representative Jayapal and Representative Smith have been very strong in this issue and pushing the folks from ICE, and Representative Jayapal has introduced a legislation to try to address this kind of issue. And so I think it's important, we sometimes, only call representatives when they're doing the wrong thing. And I think it's important to also tell them thank you when they're doing the right thing. I think our senators need to also make this a priority. And so I would urge people to reach out to them and let them know that you're concerned about this issue, because at the end of the day, Congress controls the funding for these agencies. And the only way that they've been able to continue to hold people in detention, and the tens of thousands that are in detention across the country right now, are because Congress has provided the funding to allow them to do that. And so, so that's one way of holding people accountable. And of course, there's a lot of partners and organizations locally, including friends like La Resistencia and others, who are doing great, grassroots and advocacy to continue to call attention to this. So I would encourage people also to join those efforts.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, for addressing questions, for helping inspire us all. I want to let folks know who are still with us that there will be a follow-up survey that will pop up in your window when this closes. So please take a moment to fill that out so that we can continue to provide quality virtual advocacy and learning opportunities for all of you. Tomorrow, we'll continue our journey of learning and advocacy with Cordelia Rebels, who is the Director of Immigrant and Refugee Services for Jewish Family Service. We'll talk more about the direct service capacity and what we can do to help. Again, I want to thank the generous donors to the Jewish Federation for making programming like this possible. We couldn't do it without you, as well as our large list of co-sponsors, the ADL, Bet Aleph Meditative Synagogue, Bet Havarim, Congregation Beth Shalom, Herzl Ner Tamid, the IAC Seattle, J Street, J Connect, the Jewish Coalition for Immigrant Justice Northwest, Jewish Family Service, Kavanah, Seattle Hadassah, Secular Jewish Circle, Temple Beth Temple Beth El, Temple Beth Hatfilo, Temple Beth Or, Temple to Hirsch Sinai, and the Washington State Jewish Historical Society. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and if you'd like to learn more about the work of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project and what you can do to get engaged and involved with their work, we will include also a link to their website in our follow-up email. So if any of you have questions that you didn't get answered, please feel free to reach out to us at jewishinseattle.org and we will connect you. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again so much, Jorge. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.